Zack wiped the sweat from his brow as he finished tightening the last bolt on the faulty air recycler. Life as a maintenance worker on orbital platform Z was grueling and unglamorous, but it beat the alternative of wasting away in the overcrowded slums of Earth. Here, at least, Zack could put his technical skills to use and dream of a better future. As he packed up his tools, Zack noticed a commotion in the nearby hangar bay. A group of high-ranking Zorgoth officers were disembarking from a sleek shuttlecraft, their chitinous armor glinting under the harsh lights. Curious, Zack edged closer, straining to overhear their conversation. "The human infestation will soon be cleansed," hissed Commander Zarkoth, his mandibles clicking with anticipation. "Our armada is assembling as we speak. In 3 rotations, we will descend upon their pitiful planet and burn it to cinders." Zack's blood ran cold. He had always known the Zorgoth viewed humanity as little more than vermin, but to hear them casually discuss the annihilation of his entire species was chilling. He had to warn Earth, but how? As a lowly maintenance worker, he had no access to long-range communications. Thinking quickly, Zack retreated to a nearby maintenance shaft. If he could sabotage the station's power core, it would disable the platform's defenses and buy Earth some precious time. It was a desperate plan, but he had to try. Using his intimate knowledge of the station's layout, Zack navigated the labyrinthine network of ducts and corridors, avoiding patrols and security scanners. Finally, he reached the pulsing heart of the power core. With trembling hands, Zack pried open an access panel and began rewiring the delicate circuitry. One wrong move could trigger a cascading failure that would vaporize him instantly. Sweat dripped into his eyes as he worked, his heart hammering in his chest. Just as he was about to make the final connection, alarms began to blare throughout the station. Zack cursed under his breath. Somehow, they had discovered his intrusion. He had to act fast. With a final twist of his pliers, Zack completed his sabotage. The power core stuttered and dimmed, plunging the station into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Zack scrambled back into the maintenance shaft, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the pounding of boots and angry shouts of Zorgoth soldiers as they searched for the intruder. He had to get off the station before they found him. Using his last remaining tricks, Zack managed to stow away on a garbage scow heading for Earth. As the scow undocked from the crippled station, he caught a final glimpse of the chaos he had unleashed. Alarms howled and Zorgoth ships swarmed like angry hornets. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As the scow plunged towards Earth, Zack clutched his makeshift seat and closed his eyes. He had done all he could to give his people a fighting chance. Now, it was up to the leaders of Earth to prepare for the coming storm. The Zorgoth would be enraged by the setback, and they would undoubtedly strike with even greater fury. But Zack had a sliver of hope now. If a mere pawn like him could strike a blow against the mighty Zorgoth, then perhaps humanity was not as doomed as it seemed. They would fight to their last breath, and maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to prevail. The scow shuddered as it entered Earth's atmosphere, and Zack braced himself for impact. The real battle was about to begin, and he had a feeling that this was just the opening move in a much larger game, a game that would decide the fate of his species. As the garbage scow hurtled through the atmosphere, Zack gripped the sides of his makeshift seat, his knuckles turning white. The hull shuddered and groaned, threatening to tear apart at any moment. Zack closed his eyes and prayed to whatever gods might be listening that he would survive the landing. With a bone-jarring impact, the scow crashed into the outskirts of a ruined city. Zack was thrown from his seat, landing in a heap amidst the twisted metal and debris. Groaning, he picked himself up and surveyed the damage. Miraculously, he had survived with only minor cuts and bruises. Staggering out of the wreckage, Zack looked around at the desolate landscape. The once proud city lay in ruins, its skyscrapers toppled, and its streets choked with rubble. This was the legacy of the Zorgoth's rule, a planet ravaged and broken, its people clinging to survival. But there was no time to dwell on the destruction. Zack had to find a way to warn Earth's leaders of the impending attack. He set off towards the city center, picking his way through the debris. As he walked, Zack's mind raced with questions. How had the Zorgoth become so powerful? Why did they hate humanity so much? And most importantly, how could Earth hope to stand against their might? Lost in thought, Zack almost didn't hear the sound of approaching footsteps. He ducked behind a collapsed wall just as a group of humans rounded the corner, armed with makeshift weapons. They were a ragged bunch, their clothes tattered and their faces gaunt. Zack stepped out from his hiding place, his hands raised in surrender. "Don't shoot," he called out. "I'm human, like you." The leader of the group, a grizzled man with a scar across his face, lowered his weapon cautiously. "What are you doing out here alone?" he demanded. Zack quickly explained his story, the overheard plot, his sabotage of the Zorgoth station, and his desperate escape to Earth. The leader's eyes widened as he listened. "We have to get you to the Resistance," he said urgently. "They'll know what to do with this information." The group led Zack through a series of hidden tunnels and safe houses, finally arriving at a heavily fortified bunker. Inside, Zack was introduced to the leaders of the Resistance, a motley crew of soldiers, scientists, and survivors. Zack relayed his warning to the leaders, who listened with grim faces. They had suspected the Zorgoth were planning something, but they had never imagined an attack of this scale. "We have to act fast," said General Stanton, a broad-shouldered man with piercing eyes. "We'll mobilize every ship and soldier we have. It won't be much against the Zorgoth armada, but we'll give them a fight they won't soon forget." The Resistance sprang into action, arming ships and readying defenses. Zack worked alongside them, using his knowledge of Zorgoth technology to help strengthen their meager arsenal. As the hours ticked by, tension mounted in the bunker. Everyone knew that the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Finally, a klaxon sounded, signaling the arrival of the Zorgoth fleet. On the view screens, a swarm of alien ships darkened the sky, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. The human ships rose to meet them, their hulls bristling with makeshift cannons and missile launchers. The battle was joined, and the very heavens seemed to tremble. Beams of searing light crisscrossed the void, while explosions blossomed like deadly flowers. The human ships fought with desperate courage, using every trick and tactic they could devise. But the Zorgoth were relentless, their superior numbers and technology slowly overwhelming the human defenses. One by one, Earth's ships were destroyed or crippled, until only a handful remained. In the Resistance bunker, Zack and the others watched helplessly as their last hope faded. But just as all seemed lost, a single ship broke through the Zorgoth lines and hurtled towards the largest alien vessel. It was the Valiant, piloted by Zack's mentor and friend, Captain Hawkins. With a defiant roar, Hawkins rammed his ship into the Zorgoth flagship, sacrificing himself in a blinding explosion that tore the enemy vessel apart. For a moment, the battle paused, as both sides reeled from the shock of Hawkins' sacrifice. Then, with renewed determination, the remaining human ship surged forward, capitalizing on the momentary confusion to strike deep into the heart of the Zorgoth fleet. It was a small victory, but it bought Earth a precious reprieve. The Zorgoth, their flagship destroyed and their ranks in disarray, temporarily withdrew to regroup. In the bunker, Zack and the others cheered and wept, mourning their fallen comrades while celebrating their hard-won survival. But they knew this was only the beginning. The Zorgoth would return, more terrible than ever, and Earth had to be ready. As the leaders of the Resistance began to plan their next move, Zack felt a grim resolve settle over him. He had started this fight, and he would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. For in this galactic chess game, every pawn had the potential to change the course of history, and Zack was determined to make his move count. In the aftermath of the battle, an eerie calm settled over the Earth. The Zorgoth had retreated, but everyone knew they would soon return with even greater force. The Resistance worked feverishly to repair their damaged ships and bolster their defenses, but morale was low. Many had lost friends and loved ones in the fighting, and the odds against them seemed insurmountable. Zack, however, refused to give in to despair. Captain Hawkins' sacrifice had sparked something within him, a determination to see this fight through to the end. He pored over the data they had gathered during the battle, looking for any weakness in the Zorgoth's tactics. As he studied the sensor logs, Zack noticed something odd. Just before Hawkins had rammed the Zorgith flagship, the alien ship's shields had flickered momentarily. It was only for an instant, but it gave Zack an idea. He brought his findings to General Stanton and the other resistance leaders. "I think I know how we can even the odds," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "But it's going to take a lot of courage and a little bit of luck." Zack laid out his plan. They would send a small strike team, led by Zack himself, to infiltrate one of the Zorgith's crippled ships from the previous battle. Once aboard, they would access the ship's communications array and send out a false signal, making it seem like the vessel was about to self-destruct. The Zorgith, ever cautious about losses, would likely order an immediate evacuation of the ship. That's when Zack's team would strike. They would seize control of the ship's weapons and turn them against the rest of the Zorgith fleet. With any luck, they could cause enough damage and confusion to give the Earth ships a fighting chance. It was a risky plan, but the resistance leaders agreed it was their best shot. They quickly assembled a team of their best fighters and technicians, and Zack led them in a daring raid on the crippled Zorgith ship. The infiltration went smoothly at first, with Zack's team slipping aboard the alien vessel undetected. But as they made their way to the communications array, they triggered a silent alarm. Within minutes, they were surrounded by heavily armed Zorgith soldiers. A fierce firefight broke out, with the humans using every bit of cover and cunning they could muster. Zack fought like a man possessed, driven by the memory of Captain Hawkins and all the others who had fallen. Against all odds, they managed to break through the Zorgith lines and reach the communications array. With trembling fingers, Zack input the self-destruct code and broadcast it on all frequencies. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a stirring anthill, the Zorgith ship came alive with activity. Soldiers and technicians alike scrambled for the escape pods, desperate to abandon the doomed vessel. In the confusion, Zack and his team seized control of the ship's weapon systems. They quickly targeted the nearest Zorgith vessels and opened fire, catching the alien fleet completely off guard. The Earth ships, seeing their chance, surged forward, engaging the Zorgith with renewed ferocity. The tide of battle began to turn, with the Zorgith ships falling back in disarray. But the Zorgith were not so easily defeated. From the depths of their fleet, a massive warship emerged, dwarfing anything the humans had seen before. It was a dreadnought, bristling with weapons and shielded by an impenetrable energy field. The dreadnought opened fire, its beams of searing energy cutting through the Earth's ships like a scythe through wheat. The humans' bravado turned to despair as they saw their vessels disintegrating under the onslaught. Aboard the captured Zorgith ship, Zack watched in horror as the dreadnought tore through the Earth's defenses. He knew that if they didn't stop that ship, all would be lost. With a heavy heart, Zack gave the order to abandon the captured vessel. They had done all they could here, now they had to find a way to stop that dreadnought, or all of Earth would burn. As the escape pods jettisoned away from the dying ship, Zack couldn't help but feel a sense of defeat. They had come so close to turning the tide, only to be pushed back to the brink once again. But as he looked out at the determined faces of his team, Zack felt a flicker of hope. They had proved that the Zorgith were not invincible, that courage and ingenuity could still make a difference. And as long as there were still humans willing to fight, there was always a chance, however slim, of victory. The escape pods streaked towards the nearest Earth ship, and Zack began to formulate a new plan. The dreadnought was mighty, but it had to have a weakness. And he would find it no matter the cost. For in this galactic game of chess, the pawns of Earth still had a few moves left to make. The escape pods docked with the nearest Earth ship, and Zack and his team stumbled out, exhausted and battle-weary. Around them, the ship buzzed with frantic activity as the crew rushed to repair the damage from the dreadnought's attack. Zack made his way to the bridge, where General Stanton and the other resistance leaders were gathered. They looked up as he entered, their faces etched with worry and fatigue. "That dreadnought is tearing us apart," General Stanton said grimly. "We can't hold out much longer." Zack nodded, his mind racing. He had an idea, but it was a gamble, perhaps the biggest one yet. "I think I know how we can stop it," he said slowly. "But it's going to take everything we've got." He laid out his plan. They would launch a multi-pronged attack on the Zorgoth fleet, engaging them on all fronts. While the main Earth fleet kept the enemy occupied, Zack would lead a small team in a stealth ship to infiltrate the dreadnought itself. Once aboard, they would make their way to the ship's central power core. If they could overload the core, it would cause a chain reaction that would destroy the dreadnought from within. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. General Stanton gave the order, and the Earth fleet sprang into action. As the battle raged around them, Zack and his team slipped away in their stealth ship. They approached the dreadnought cautiously, using every bit of skill and subterfuge to avoid detection. Finally, they reached the massive ship's hull. Using cutting lasers, they carved out an entry point and slipped inside, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. The interior of the dreadnought was a labyrinth of twisting corridors and cavernous chambers. Zack led his team deeper into the ship, guided by a schematic he had managed to download during their previous raid. As they approached the central power core, they encountered fierce resistance from the Zorgoth guards. Blaster fire filled the air, and the screams of the dying echoed through the halls. Zack fought like a man possessed, driven by a grim determination to see this through. He had lost too much, seen too many friends fall, to turn back now. Finally, they reached the power core, a massive, pulsing sphere of energy that thrummed with an eerie light. Zack and his team quickly set to work, rigging explosives and rewiring circuits to overload the core. But just as they were about to make their escape, a squad of Zorgoth elite guards burst into the chamber. A vicious firefight ensued, with Zack and his team fighting desperately to hold them off. In the chaos, Zack saw his chance. He lunged for the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he input the final overload sequence. The Zorgoth guards, seeing what he was doing, let out a howl of rage and surged forward. But it was too late. With a final, defiant yell, Zack hit the activation button and the power core began to overload. Alarms blared throughout the dreadnought as the core went critical. Zack and his team raced for their lives, fighting their way back to their stealth ship even as the dreadnought began to tear itself apart from within. They barely made it out before the ship exploded, a blinding flash of light that lit up the void of space. The shockwave ripped through the Zorgoth fleet, sending ships tumbling and sparking with damage. On the bridge of the Earth flagship, General Stanton and the others watched in awe as the dreadnought disintegrated before their eyes. A cheer went up from the crew as they realized what had happened. The humans had struck a decisive blow against the Zorgoth, and the tide of battle had turned. But even as they celebrated, a new alarm sounded. The Zorgoth flagship, enraged by the loss of their dreadnought, was charging up its main weapon, a planet-killer beam capable of wiping out all life on Earth. Zack, still reeling from his narrow escape, knew what he had to do. There was no time for a clever plan or a daring infiltration. Sometimes, the only move left on the board was a sacrificial one. He turned to his team, his eyes blazing with resolve. "Get to the escape pods," he said softly. "I'll take it from here." Before they could protest, Zack was gone, racing towards the hangar bay and the one ship fast enough to reach the Zorgoth flagship in time, the experimental fighter he had been tinkering with for months. As he blasted out of the hangar and towards the looming bulk of the flagship, Zack felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had always known, somehow, that it would come to this, a final, desperate gambit with the fate of humanity hanging in the balance. He thought of all the people he had lost, all the sacrifices that had been made to bring them to this moment. Captain Hawkins, his mentor and friend. The brave soldiers of the resistance fighting against impossible odds. The countless civilians huddled in bunkers and praying for a miracle. They were all counting on him now, whether they knew it or not. And he would not let them down. The Zorgoth flagship loomed before him, its planet-killer beam glowing with an eerie, sickly light. Zack gripped the controls of his fighter, his jaw set with determination. He had one last trick up his sleeve, a payload of experimental nanobots designed to seek out and destroy key systems within the Zorgoth ship. If he could get close enough to release them, it might just give the Earth fleet the chance it needed. Zack flew headlong towards the flagship, dodging and weaving through a hailstorm of enemy fire. His shields flared and sparked, but he pushed on, his eyes locked on his target. As he reached the critical range, Zack slammed his fist down on the release button, sending a swarm of nanobots streaming towards the flagship. At the same time, he yanked back on the controls, sending his fighter into a gut-wrenching loop away from the ship. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a series of firecrackers going off, explosions began to ripple across the surface of the Zorgoth flagship. Its lights flickered and died, and the eerie glow of its planet-killer beam sputtered out. A ragged cheer went up from the Earth fleet as they saw their chance. As one, they surged forward, pouring every last ounce of firepower into the crippled flagship. In his cockpit, Zack watched with a fierce grin as the ship that had haunted his nightmares for so long began to crumble under the onslaught. They had done it. Against all odds, the pawns of Earth had outplayed the masters of the galactic game. But even as he savored the victory, Zack knew that the game was not yet over. The Zorgoth were a tenacious enemy, and they would not accept defeat easily. There would be more battles to come, more sacrifices to be made. But for now, in this one shining moment, the humans had triumphed. And as long as there were still those willing to fight, to scheme, to risk everything for the sake of others, then there would always be hope, flickering in the darkness of space like the stubborn light of a distant star. In the aftermath of the Dreadnought's destruction and the crippling blow dealt to the Zorgoth flagship, the battle hung in a precarious balance. The Earth fleet, emboldened by their success, pressed their attack, while the Zorgoth regrouped and prepared for a final, desperate assault. On the bridge of the Earth flagship, General Stanton and his officers watched the tactical displays with grim determination. They knew that this was the moment that would decide the fate of their world, one final, all-or-nothing gambit. Zack, still reeling from his daring attack on the flagship, limped onto the bridge, his flight suit scorched and torn. General Stanton turned to him, his eyes glinting with a newfound respect. "That was one hell of a move, son," he said gruffly. "You may have just given us the chance we needed." But even as he spoke, a new alarm blared through the ship. On the view screen, the Zorgoth fleet was moving into position, their ships forming up into a massive, impenetrable wall. "They're preparing for a final bombardment," one of the officers said, his voice trembling. "They're going to throw everything they have at us." General Stanton nodded grimly. "Then we'll just have to throw everything we have right back at them." He turned to Zack, his expression serious. "I need you out there, leading the fighter squadrons. You're the best pilot we've got, and we need every ship in the air if we're going to survive this." Zack hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll do my best, sir." He raced back to the hangar bay, where his fighter was already being prepped for launch. As he climbed into the cockpit, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was what he had been born for, this final, desperate battle against impossible odds. The Earth fighters swarmed out to meet the oncoming Zorgoth ships, their weapons blazing. Zack flew at the head of the formation, his movements precise and deadly. He had always been a skilled pilot, but now, with the fate of his world hanging in the balance, he pushed himself to new heights of skill and daring. Around him, the battle raged with a ferocity that defied description. Ships exploded in dazzling fireballs, while beams of searing energy crisscrossed the void. The Earth fleet fought with a desperate courage, throwing themselves against the Zorgoth lines again and again. But the Zorgoth were relentless, their superior numbers and technology slowly whittling away at the human defenses. One by one, Earth's ships fell, until only a ragged handful remained. In the chaos of the battle, Zack found himself face-to-face with a massive Zorgoth battlecruiser. He knew that he couldn't take it down alone, but perhaps, with a little bit of luck and a lot of courage, he could buy his fellow humans the time they needed. With a defiant yell, Zack threw his fighter into a suicidal charge, weaving through a hailstorm of enemy fire as he raced towards the battlecruiser's bridge. At the last moment, he fired his remaining missiles and pulled away, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The missiles struck home, blasting through the battlecruiser's shields and detonating deep within its hull. The massive ship shuddered and sparked, its lights flickering and dying. But even as it began to break apart, the battlecruiser fired one final, desperate salvo. A beam of blinding energy lanced out, striking the Earth flagship dead center. On the bridge, General Stanton and his officers were thrown to the deck as the ship shuddered under the impact. Alarms blared and smoke filled the air, but somehow, miraculously, the flagship held together. With a groan of tortured metal, the Zorgith battlecruiser exploded, sending debris spinning through the void. And in that moment, something strange happened. Across the battlefield, Zorgith ships began to break formation, peeling away from the fight and fleeing into the depths of space. On the comm channels, a cacophony of alien voices erupted, all shouting the same thing: cease fire. Cease fire. In the Earth flagship, General Stanton and his officers watched in stunned disbelief as the Zorgith fleet disengaged and began to retreat. It took them a moment to realize what had happened. In destroying the battlecruiser, Zack had taken out the Zorgith High Command, throwing their entire fleet into disarray. It was a stunning victory, but one that had come at a terrible cost. Earth's fleet lay in ruins, and countless lives had been lost. But they had done the impossible. They had beaten back the Zorgith invasion and saved their world from annihilation. As the last of the Zorgith ships vanished into the depths of space, a cheer went up from the survivors of Earth's fleet. They had won, battered and bloodied, but unbowed. But Zack, alone in his cockpit, felt no triumph, only a bone-deep weariness and a sense of hollow loss. So many had given their lives to see this day, and he knew that the scars of this battle would linger long after the last ships had been repaired and the last memorial services had been held. But as he looked out at the stars, glittering cold and bright in the endless void, he felt a flicker of something else, a stubborn, unyielding hope. The Zorgith had been beaten, but they would be back. And when they came, Earth would be ready. For they were the pawns who had dared to challenge the masters of the game, the underdogs who had rewritten the rules of galactic warfare. And as long as there were still those willing to stand up and fight, to risk everything for the sake of their world and their species, then there would always be hope, burning bright against the darkness of space. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. And in the great galactic chess game, there were still countless moves left to make. In the days and weeks following the climactic battle, an uneasy peace settled over the galaxy. The Zorgith, their command structure shattered and their fleet in disarray, retreated to the farthest reaches of their empire to lick their wounds and regroup. On Earth, the survivors of the Resistance emerged from their bunkers and shelters, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight of a world free from alien occupation. They looked to the sky with a newfound sense of hope and pride, knowing that they had stood against the might of a galactic superpower and emerged victorious. But the cost of that victory had been high. Cities lay in ruins, and entire continents had been scarred by the ravages of war. And in the hearts of every human, there was a gaping wound, a sense of loss and tragedy that would never fully heal. For Zack, the weight of that loss was almost too much to bear. He had seen too many friends and comrades fall, had watched too many ships burn and crumble in the unforgiving void of space. And though he was hailed as a hero by the people of Earth, he found little solace in their praise. Instead, he threw himself into the work of rebuilding, using his skills and knowledge to help repair the shattered infrastructure of his world. It was a daunting task, but one that gave him a sense of purpose and direction in the aftermath of the war. As the weeks turned into months, the tenuous peace between Earth and the Zorgith began to solidify into something more lasting. Emissaries were exchanged, and tentative agreements were reached, a recognition that neither side could afford another all-out war. But even as the diplomats and politicians worked to forge a new galactic order, there were those who looked to the stars with unease. For they knew that the Zorgith were not the only threat out there, and that the universe was vast and full of untold dangers. And so, a new chapter in Earth's history began, a chapter marked by rebuilding, by diplomacy, and by a newfound sense of unity and purpose. The human race had been forged in the crucible of war, and had emerged stronger and more resilient than ever before. As for Zack, he found himself at a crossroads. The war had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand, and he knew that he could never go back to the life he had led before. And so, with a heavy heart, he made a decision. He would leave Earth and its budding civilization behind and strike out into the stars once more. Not as a soldier or a warrior, but as an explorer and a seeker of knowledge. For he knew that the galaxy was vast and full of wonders, and that there were countless mysteries waiting to be unraveled. And though the scars of war would always be with him, he found a strange sense of peace in the idea of losing himself among the stars. As he boarded his ship and prepared to depart, Zack took one last look at the world that had shaped him. It was a world that had known pain and suffering, but also courage and hope. A world that had dared to stand against the darkness and had emerged victorious. And though he knew that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, Zack felt a sense of excitement and purpose that he had never known before. For he was no longer just a pawn in the great galactic game, he was a player in his own right, with a destiny all his own. As his ship lifted off and soared into the sky, Zack felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. The war may have been over, but his journey was just beginning. And whatever lay ahead, he knew that he would face it with the same courage and determination that had carried him through the darkest days of the conflict. For he was human, a member of a species that had looked into the face of annihilation and refused to blink. A species that had rewritten the rules of galactic warfare and had emerged as a force to be reckoned with on the cosmic stage. And as long as there were still those like him, those willing to explore, to discover, to push the boundaries of what was possible, then the future was bright and full of endless possibility. The stalemate may have endured, but the game was far from over. And in the great cosmic chess match between order and chaos, light and darkness, there were still countless moves left to be made. Only time would tell what the next chapter held. But one thing was certain. The pawns of Earth had earned their place at the table, and they would not be underestimated again. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was a good thing. For in the end, it was not the kings and queens who had decided the fate of the cosmos. It was the pawns, the ordinary men and women who had risen to extraordinary heights in the face of overwhelming odds. And as long as there were still those willing to stand up and fight for what they believed in, there would always be hope, a light to guide the way through the darkness of an uncaring universe.